African regional representative. So as per our title of the webinar today, we have two topics that we are going to discuss. The first topic is going to be from theory to practice. That is, how can we utilize health professions education research in Africa? This will be led by Dr. Champion Nyoni, who is a senior researcher at the School of Nursing, Faculty of Health Sciences, University of Free State in South Africa. We'll then move on to the next topic, which is decolonizing health professions education research in the African context, which will be given to us by Dr. Ronel Matt, who is the head of department, Faculty of Dentistry, the University of Western Cape, South Africa. With that said, our housekeeping norms will be, please keep your microphones on mute and keep your videos off so that we can be able to get a proper stream and a clear proceeding of the entire session. I'll then now move on to hand over to Dr. Champion Nyoni to lead us in the next or first topic, from theory to practice. How can we utilize health professions education research in Africa? Over to you, Dr. Champion.
Sorry, I've just been talking to myself. I'm still navigating to make sure that this comes through. Can you hear me, Faith?
Yes, sure. We can hear you. Just to turn your slides to slide mode, yeah.
All right. And now?
Yeah, all is great. And over to you.
Okay. I'll just take this down. I'm trying to see if you can see me, and then we are good to go. All right. Okay, good afternoon, colleagues, and good afternoon, friends from all over. And thank you very much for organizing this webinar. And thank you for the invitation to come and share a conversation or a perspective around transferring or thinking about translating theory to practice for health professions education research in Africa. I think this is more or less 1 year later after last year I was in this very same space in AFREhealth, where the conversation of that particular webinar was around the transfer, or it was around translation, actually, translation into health professions education or health professions education into practice. So when I got the invitation to come and talk today, it felt like we have come in full circle, or this is becoming a mature problem within the African space around looking at the evidence that we are generating in Africa and how that evidence needs to influence our practice, that we are constantly or looking at how we can change our practice. So my conversation for today is really going to look at some of the practical thoughts that I have around moving this theory from theory to practice from a more practical perspective over, the philosophical stories about translational research and translational models, but putting it down on the ground to say, what can one do to make it happen? I also wanted to share with you, maybe this would be a nice departure point, the story about this student of mine, Paul. Let's just call him Paul. Paul is actually employed as we speak at an African institution, which we shall not mention the name, and is enrolled in a doctoral program at our university. So one of the conversations that we have had with Paul was around him feeling extremely despondent about health professions education and the research, and how he sees that things eventually do not change. Paul comes in from an institution where he feels that everybody who's in the institution is calm and quiet, and they continue doing things the same way that they have been doing. And sometimes these things are not giving us the same outputs, or the methods that he sees being used in the universities are still the same old methods that have been used when the universities were being established. He mentioned to me that he feels like the lecturers or us as facilitators sometimes are not in touch with our students who have moved light years ahead of us in terms of, for example, technology, and that it's very difficult to start a conversation with faculty or with senior faculty for that matter on how do we change this, or how do we start this process of saying perhaps these methods of teaching, these methods of assessment, these methods of educational research are a bit old. So he had attempted such a process in his institution, and he felt very disappointed as there was less critical mass, less buy-in, and it eventually became his own issue, which he also eventually abandoned. So his study is about how to actually support institutions in making educational transformations. So when Paul was sharing this story, it also resonated with what we are talking about today, of realizing that there is lots of evidence around some of the health professions, some of the health professions outcomes, some of the interventions and artifacts that have been proven to work in various contexts, and sometimes in contexts that are similar to us. But the big challenge often is, how do we adopt, and how do we assimilate, how do we move these issues or these innovations or these artifacts to embed them within our own programs and within our own institutions. And I will sort of touch based on some of the elements that from some tested models and some of the stuff that we have sort of tried in 1 or 2 countries. And it's up to you to think, does it work? Does it not work? And do you think that could be something practical? And I guess that would be up for discussion. So our area of discussion would be around these considerations of implementing HPER. This is health professions education research. What becomes the main things that one needs to have in the back of your mind when you are thinking of moving from theory to practice? Then taking a step back to look at what is this theory that you are saying you want to move from the theory into practice? How does the context look like? Because that's another important factor that needs to come into consideration when one thinks about, we want to move this into practice. But the question is, where is this practice based, and is it ready to receive this theory? And then who is actually facilitating this implementation, which for me is always the brilliant catalyst of trying to get things done. And then I'm sure there is a time where we'll have your own thoughts about your own practical experiences on how this could work within your institution, what you have tried in your institution, and what additional information we can gain as we learn with each other. So the frame of this talk will be around the 3 issues. What is the nature of the theory? What is the context in which this is going to happen? And then finally, the facilitators. And I sort of structured the conversation more around questions that one should ask around the nature of the theory, around the context, and around the facilitator. And in the conversation, we'll unpack each question. So when we talk about theory into practice, I think the big question I had was, what is this theory that we are talking about? And often we want to aim to improve something. We have identified a problem with something at our institution, be it that we think the methods of teaching are not up to date. And often the big one is always the assessment outcomes, that the students do not do this, the students are not able to do this, they're not competent. It's always the story, the students are outdated, or the students are not able. So the driver towards one thinking about engaging theory often starts with a particular observation, a particular problem which is existing within that particular institution. And one big issue is one to think about unpacking this particular problem for you to be able to identify which particular HPE theory or which particular HPE information or content or artifact that you'd want to bring in to solve the problem. So it wouldn't be prudent, for example, to be worried about assessment outcomes when the big problem actually is the issues that happens within the teaching and learning, or maybe the big problem for the teaching and learning to be where it has got to do with the curricular design and things like that. So start the departure point for thinking about integrating HPER or HPE theory. It looks at how do we unpack what is our problem? What is the issue that we want to deal with within our institution? And I often find it quite nice to already have this conversation with your colleagues and how your colleagues, do they perceive this problem the same way you do? Do they agree with you when it comes to, you think the source is here, or do you think the source of this particular problem is? And it starts the conversation in this way, where in some cases can be starting the process of developing a critical mass about the existence of the problem towards a solution. So getting the problem right, and then now thinking about this problem to link with what is then the appropriate theory to address your problem. For example, if the issue is around that the teaching and learning methods are not aligned with what the students are talking about, or are not aligned with the so-called 21st century competencies, or are not aligned with this, then that sort of directs you to look at the specific literature or the specific theory or the specific content that you think may address your issue. And again, as you're engaging with this content, the idea for me is to say, what is this content or this theory that you're bringing to the setting? How mature is this setting? Is there already is this content? Is there already evidence around its efficacy? And is this evidence sufficient? Is this evidence on how it works similar? Conducted in a context that's similar to yours? Are there issues that we can learn about the evidence that can be translated to your context? Or are you still thinking that, well, the evidence hasn't really generated a lot of interest and we are still in a trial phase? So making a decision again about what do you bring about that theory into your context becomes quite important to your setting, especially if you would be expected, for example, to convince your stakeholders or to convince people to say, we think, you know, using TikTok as an approach to teach students creative skills actually works, because in settings similar to us and settings different to us, this has been sort of the reported outcomes around this particular strategy. But we've also noted, I think we are busy with another study that looks at the reporting of educational interventions, and what we are seeing as well, most of the studies are not as sufficient in terms of discussing how the intervention was done, who did the interventions, and all the elements. So you might still find within this so-called theory that there are so many gaps that might need to be complemented and supplemented by additional engagement with the literature and additional engagement with your setting. And so unpacking also the reasoning behind this particular intervention or this particular theory often is an interesting issue, that sometimes we look at something and we think this is working, but if we're not so clued on why it is the way it is and what is the reasoning behind the thinking, or the reasoning behind the action rather, it becomes a bit of a problem if the thought is to move this into practice. Because obviously, in my experience, that it's always very difficult to get 100% translation of one thing to the next. But if we are guarded with the underlying principles and the underlying philosophies and thinking about doing things, we can still implement a sort of similar issue, but knowing that it might not look 100%, but the thinking and the reasoning comes in that particular approach. And another important question that I often think about as you are the translator or the person who's moving the theory into practice is that, do you understand it as the person who's interested of this theory, of this content? Do you understand it sufficiently that you are able to inform and influence others? It's very difficult to come and say, I think we need to use MCQs as an assessment for knowledge. And then we're asking, but what do you mean MCQs? And you also have no idea what MCQs are. And already we start to have doubts about the intervention and the chances of it actually sailing becomes a problem. So what was my main issue around the theory? I think the initial issue is to think of what is it that what do we want to solve? What is the problem? And are we sure this is the problem? And getting buy-in into that particular problem. And then using the problem to align with a specific theory that we're looking for. If the students are not working together, how do we use IPE as a vehicle? If this, and then getting to understand what's the reasoning and what's the thinking behind this theory, to lead to your own sufficient understanding of this particular theory before consideration of moving it into your context. Now, the concept of context is often a very sticky one to discuss, because of so many interpretations and understanding of what context is. And some people allude context to a geographical space, others look at the context in a regional space, in a cultural space, in people spaces. And sometimes we make assumptions about similarities of context. I know we all get to be bracketed low and middle income countries, or sub-Saharan Africa, or the African context. And often it's quite difficult to unpack what the context looks like. But for this particular conversation, I wanted to draw your context specifically to your setting or to your institution. And as you're thinking of engaging with this theory and moving this theory into your particular setting, one of the big issues that one could consider is, do you have the sufficient physical resources for your setting that are aligned with that particular theory? In one country, we introduced the objective structured clinical exam as an approach to assess students at the final year of their program. And one of the issues that became quite strong was that for one to do a proper OSCE, there needs to be specific number of stations, which needs specific number of resources per station to enhance authenticity of the assessment or authenticity of the stations. And once you don't have these resources within the setting, we started to see situations where the OSCE was eventually converted into writing stations, and then the writing stations eventually looked like an exam where students just get 10 minutes to answer question 1, 10 minutes to answer question 2, and in the bracket of an OSCE. And the underlying issue was that there were no physical resources within this particular setting to translate or to implement this health professions education theory or concept or artifact into that setting. So it's important to consider first, do we have the physical resources to implement this? Can we have the financial resources to implement the setting? And what we are constantly facing in our education, I'm sure it's all over the world now, that we are getting budget cuts, the monies are just not enough. We are coming all from a global pandemic plus a recession and the war and this, and the purse is constantly getting tighter and tighter, and we are constantly expected to get more students on board. And a consideration of how do you make a process as cost effective as possible becomes the priorities of administrators and leadership. And again, how do you make it within the HPR theory framework or artifact that you make it work in your institution, bringing in a fantastic artifact that has worked, for example, in Switzerland or in the Netherlands. Usually that's where a lot of HPR research comes from, into your setting where there's literally no financial backup, there will be no extended money into your department, actually sets you up for failure. So when the physical resources and the financial resources are not in place, it becomes very difficult to think about translating anything on the ground. A consideration again is around your operational boundaries, and that's one thing that one needs to look very, very carefully, linking it with your organizational culture. And how does your organization respond to change? How does your organization respond to innovation? And being quite sensitive about the process in which the organization needs to unfold. Some organizations are ready and willing, and whenever there's something that's coming through, they're ready to run with the process, and then 3 months later they're wondering what we're doing, but we have agreed. While other organizations, the wheel turns a little bit slower, and people still need to brew on things and understand, and you need to have that sort of understanding within your pace, within your space of what sort of culture do we have here when it comes to introducing new issues? And if this is the culture, what sort of strategy can one have to align with meeting the targets of introducing this innovation at the same time, not expecting too much that tomorrow there will be change? So that needs to be thought of as a priority issue. Another important issue, again, is got to do with patterns of power and authority. There's interesting stuff around the influence of power and authority and the sustainability of interventions, that we can start something, and then sometimes if it's top down, then people feel that this has been pushed down on them, and so they won't really do it as expected. And then sometimes when it's bottom up, and then the process becomes a little bit longer to get everybody to turn into the wheel. So one needs to balance that argument quite cleverly and look at, within your particular situation, within your particular context, what is the process and what are the patterns of power and authority? Where are decisions made, and what is the influence of the decisions on individuals within your institution? I was involved in a space where we initially brought in an idea, and the idea was to say, first have a consensus amongst the people and build this argument towards power and authority to say we've got everybody on board. But it took so long, and the people were not committed to be part of this. And so the thing went on until the people that were driving the change got so despondent. But in a different setting where the power or the authority within the institution had a fantastic relationship with the people on below them, and they were able to crack the whip, this is what we are doing, and everybody was able to fall in line, and then we started to see change happening. So this is different depending on your context and your situation. So one needs to be on top of the pulse in examining what does your institution look like, and being strategic in then influencing which power authority to get the issues done. And again, looking at eventually how will we evaluate all of this for the purpose of what we want. So at the back of your mind, there's the issue around the culture of the institution, which is often, in a continuum on the low end where people are not receptive to innovations, and the high end where people run towards innovations, and then tailor making your strategies to say, if there is a culture of adopting innovations, how do we unpack this? If there's a culture of not adopting innovations, how do we tailor make this process for my particular context? And then thinking about the leadership dimensions as well. Where do you facilitate the leadership? Where does power and authority come in? And do we need to first get a buy-in from the head of the institution and it trickles down? Or do we need buy-in from the team first as we engage with the head of the institution? And having an idea of evaluating the implementation in mind. So coming down to almost my last slide. So we have spoken about the intervention or the theory. We've spoken about the institution. You also have a particular role if you are leading this process of introducing theory into practice. And I want to put you as a facilitator of the change, or the facilitator of introduction of the theory into practice. And one of the big issues is around looking at yourself as a catalyst. And a catalyst lives, breathes, and stimulates this intervention, this innovation, this HPER theory into practice. You need to sort of emulate what you want to see happening on the ground. You need to be driven around seeing this work within your institution. And that sort of starts to also build in confidence with some of the people that you're working in. And your main role is to look at making the process easier for others. So we want to introduce MCQs. We've got the buy-in from the heads of the institutions that yes, MCQs would work in our particular setting. And then you come to Champion's office. Champion has been using long questions or has been setting a paper in this particular way. And I see this is the new approach of doing things. As a facilitator of the change, how do you make my life easier that I also buy into this process? How do you support me to actually, start to build on integrating this into my into my role. So you enable me to get to implement this particular change, and working towards a sort of a broader spectrum of function, and thinking in most cases about as you enhance your function, and also being the example that you cannot be advocating for something that you are not practicing, something that you are also not competent in doing, and something that you are not clear in doing. I often find creating milestones quite useful to look at where we want to be, breaking it into smaller chunks. Even if it's a buy-in that we've got, we celebrate that success, and then we build on to the next success, and being realistic in how we do things. Often senior colleagues that I've worked with, they always say, no, you young ones, you come in and you say we want to do things. We have been doing things this way. And how do we work towards, creating this? Don't expect me to change overnight because this is the new thing that's happening, but facilitate this process that I see the value of it. I see the successes that you're celebrating within reasonable milestones. So once we get our outcomes, we start to improve on these outcomes, and then we start to also start our own narration of how we implemented this, on how we implemented this innovation, and what were the sort of thoughts that we brought in our process of implementing the story. And again, it feeds back into the generation of HPER theory, and now I think more pragmatically from an African context, which again contributes to the theory, to the literature, and then we start to see more growth in that particular process. I think I am slightly over my time, colleagues. I would invite us to have questions maybe after Dr. Ronell's presentation, but thank you very much for taking your time to listen to this. I can't wait to hear how you are working towards integrating HPER research into your practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nyoni. We'll move on to Dr. Ronell Matt's presentation, which is pretty much going to give us an overview on the topic, decolonizing health professions, education, research in the African context. Over to you, Dr. Ronell.
Yes, good. Let me just switch on my camera. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak on a topic that we normally speak while having coffee at conferences and training. I also want to acknowledge, I think, the speaker champion before me, because I think it's important for him to have done and spoken about MIPH's story. Because this is where I want to actually also take the story forward and actually think about, so when the research is done, how do we disseminate the research with the evidence that he has developed with his research. So I am Ronell. I'm in South Africa. I am in a dental faculty, and my interest is research, health professions, education. I think it's important that we discuss this, and for this presentation this morning, this afternoon, I think what my intention is that I'm going to have to look at and share the literature around decolonization of HPE research, because it's an area that I was struggling to find context with where we want or where I would like our discourse to move. So I'm going to share some of the literature and some of the challenges that I had found during this time when I was preparing for the talk, and then hopefully towards the end raise some questions that would assist us in our conversations that we have, and hopefully bring us to a perspective in our African context. So the first thing is, when I looked at the literature, it was all about decolonizing very strongly with global health came out, and then there was various aspects of deconstruction and decolonization within the literature. And so it was about moving and incorporating Indigenous health, all of those additional issues that would be inclusive of decolonizing. However, I found that in order for us to focus on HPE research, I thought that that we need to focus on one specific area. And colonial refers not only to the North-South, but also to the way in which knowledge can be imposed on others through imperial relationships. And this is what was said in 2016. The author was a Canadian nurse who then worked in Africa. And that knowledge is validated and privileged as opposed to other forms of knowledge that she had found in some communities. So if we are going to look at HPE research and decolonization thereof, it is unlike diversification that is often referred to now, and it specifically acknowledges the inherent power relationships in the production and dissemination of knowledge. And it seeks to destabilize these and allowing new forms of knowledge that will represent the marginalized groups that we form part of, and especially in our African context, this is what we need to look at and discuss and debate if we want to contribute towards dissemination of the knowledge that we found. So we cannot move on to discussing decolonization if we don't elude and if we don't touch on the North-South relationship. And there's a growing awareness of how the knowledge is generated in some of the papers, one of the papers that I've read, in high-income countries that define practices and informs thinkings to the detriment of the knowledge of systems in the low and medium-income systems. So additionally, the research partners often benefit the better resource partner opposed to your low and medium income countries. And colonialism directly impacted medical practice and education in the past in Africa by using medicine as a tool for domination and control. And some of the examples that was used in this paper was that research was focused on to improve the health of the soldiers in that time, the colonial people, and the research was pushed for a remedy specifically to that purpose. So when we move our lens to our continent, there's definitely decolonization needs to gain the credibility and traction within the academia. And not only in terms of the curriculum that is mostly, we found the literature is speaking about in incorporating of these terms and these issues within our curriculum, but also in our hiring and promotion. And this afternoon, the topic is about publishing or dissemination of the knowledge. And this is where it is important that, yes, in the introduction of the, and the flyer of this webinar, there's an increase in the HPE research in the literature. However, there is a domination still, and with some of the countries in the north and some authors of this paper. So how do we move from knowledge and theory to practice, but also how do we publish and disseminate our own research within our continent? And in order to do so, I found a paper that was very descriptive, and apologies for sharing this particular paper. But I thought it was important for us to understand what is really happening in medical education. So this paper looked at academic publishing over a period of 10 years. And academic publishing is the primary means of disseminating scientific knowledge in medical education. Hence, I think it was, we can think about the definition of this and how this then, as a consequence of this, would mean that the power then would move, and your emphasis would be on the authors of these publications that is moving, and the voices of these authors who publish in medical education have a powerful impact on the discourses of the community. Therefore, it's important that if we are talking and having conversations today about the discourse of HPE research in Africa, we need to make sure that we move and we carefully debate of how our impact on the discourses is, without really looking at critically how we publish and disseminate our knowledge that we in our specific context. So this journal looked at 24 medical educations. This article looked at 24 journals published in a 20-year period, and it tried to identify the emphasis on the gender of the author, the geographical location, and also the institutional affiliation. And overall, on the top cited authors in the 22 journals, the top 9 was males. And I was sharing this with a colleague, and I asked the colleague, so can I give you 2 guess who is the top male? And her first response was the right one, the author, the male author who came up number 1. So males were definitely more prevalent compared to females. And then also the top 10 countries affiliation, which was also quite obvious. That was the United States that accounted for 40%, the United Kingdom 12, and Canada 10. Your lower and middle income countries accounted for about under 10. And across all authors, the affiliations was mostly ranked by, according to the Times, in the top 200. When I look at the limitations of it, there's quite a few of this paper. And one of them was, number 1, that the authors also of this particular paper was exactly also coming from your top countries as this paper, and also in regard to gender. And as well as the including journals was also the top ranking journals. It only had 1 African journal that was included in the study. So there for me, that was also a point of contentious issue when I looked at it. So now that we know what's happening in our literature, how does the decolonizing imperative, and what does it mean for HPE research in Africa? Firstly, when we speak about decolonization and decolonizing the research, it is important to position where we are in HPE, and that we need to acknowledge the influence, the colonial influences that exist. And in that, it means that we need to make sure that we acknowledge the past, and also how this is framed where we are in terms of our teaching, our learning, and our research. And which is quite a different lens that we are used to. And as a consequence of colonization, some professions in HPE brings forms of hierarchical power relations that's constructed by the knowledge and the disciplinary knowledge gained, as well as the consequence of clinical practice. And yeah, I think it's important that we unpack this a bit, because it is the colonial influence that would bring around and about some power relationships that exist within the disciplines. And we experience this in various norms. And when in my conversations in the past and even current, when we talk amongst different disciplines, there's sometimes not a very subtle power relationship that exists within clinical practice around the bedside, in my particular discipline, and that's why I can speak from my personal experience. As a dentist, the whole structure of how we work in clinical practice is a very hierarchical power relationship, but it's up to us to make the change in how we acknowledge that it does exist and how you move forward in how you engage with people and collaborate with colleagues across disciplines. When you are in a collaborative research field, this is important to acknowledge so that it does exist. However, your IPE in practice and your collaborative research is a perfect vehicle to deconstruct the power relationship that exists, because each discipline brings a different lens and look at the problem differently and could contribute to the richness of your research. So we need to acknowledge and we need to deconstruct this power relationship that exists. And that's for me, is the very important start. And some of the questions that we need to ask this afternoon when we have our conversation is, how do we reframe and redirect HPE research in our African context? And given that Champion has unfolded, how we could use the evidence in our specific context. And also the second question, I think it's quite important for us to talk about, is how do we position Africa and African ways of knowing in relation to the global north? This is two questions that I would like us to chat about this afternoon. And then there's possible strategies, some that I've found in the literatures, others that I have tried and distilled from what my personal experience as well as some research experience, is that where AFREhealth is really striving that we are moving a lot more into collaborative research in practice, in IPE that I've spoke about, and also by researching, and this will assist in the reframing and redirecting the HPE research agenda. And then setting research priorities and our agenda specifically for our context. So there has been a study where that has set, but I think this is an area that it's very dynamic. So this is where we need to set our own agendas, research agendas specifically for our own context. And in knowledge production and the dissemination of that is important. So we need to publish. And here I have saw a article about the Lancet, who had now made a statement to say they will reject articles that do not acknowledge contributors from Africa if it's not included. So slowly and surely, I think the awareness is happening. And also the one strategy that we need to, I think on another level is, yes, it's good and well that we do research, that we produce new knowledge, but on a level of then how do we develop our own theory using our own specific stories and our own specific context. Once you move from just having results and seeing the change, but developing a theory that is specific to our context. This is something that I think that we should consider in our discussion as well. And I thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ronel, Mart, and Dr. Nyoni. We now move to the next or last section of this webinar, which is the question and answers session to the panel. So colleagues, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat so that we can be able to project them to the facilitators. All right. All right, I see a compliment to both of you from Professor Marite, that great presentation. Thanks, I enjoyed that. Let's see. All right. As the questions come in from the chat, to Dr. Champion and Dr. Ronell, I have just a couple of questions probably that I can pose to you so that you can be able to discuss them together as a panel in relation to what we've discussed today. So the first question is, we've really enjoyed the presentation from theory to practice, and this really points that there is a process to this. But oftentimes, Dr. Champion and Dr. Ronell, the process is really a bit tedious. And sometimes you may not even get the results of what you're looking for if you want to really now advance your research and have it implemented. There is a lot of bureaucracy, and that involves us understanding our operational and organizational culture and all that, as you've said. But how can we practically really make this move? We know it's a barrier. We know it's so bureaucratic. We know all these things, but how can we practically make a step to translating our research to practice and all that? Over to you, Dr. Champion.
Yeah, Faith, it's really, it's a very multifaceted issue. I agree with you there. And giving an overview of the steps doesn't guarantee, doesn't guarantee that eventually the outcome becomes what we want to do. And what I've often seen amongst us is sometimes we want things to be done, and we want things to be done immediately, and we see the value of it, but we struggle to get everybody else to have buy-in. What we are picking from experience and also from the literature strongly talks to having a critical mass. The moment you start to have colleagues that are buying in with your discussion sets up the conversation a bit more. Getting to use platforms like this to start connecting and having people that have a sort of a like-minded in your direction. For example, with IPE, starting to look at what are the alternatives and what strategies can one use in the institution has also been seen as a driver. But often it really looks back at your culture in the institution. How do we get change done? When do we get our leaders to be part of the process? How do we get the leaders to understand this bureaucracy? Who makes the bureaucracy, and how do we get to that person who makes the bureaucracy? And being realistic with the timelines, that sometimes we think this is good, this should happen now, and more often than not, it often takes a lifetime, not a lifetime, but quite a while to get issues out. I don't know if Ronell has any thoughts on this.
No, thank you. Thank you for the question, Faith. I agree with Champion. I think the best way to move forward is with collaboration. So whether you have just completed or during your research, by collaboration and finding your critical mass, like Champion said, is one of the strategies that we have at all levels of your journey as a researcher. So then you would move this forward into practice. To fight alone and to move alone is challenging, but to have various organizations and networks that we can tap into, that is important to move your theory into practice.
All right, thank you so much. And indeed, that's the spirit of AFREhealth, with a common saying: if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. But most importantly, without leaving anyone behind. It is commonly said by Professor Marite, Professor Abigail, and all that. So I really, truly agree with the situation of going together. Now we have 2 questions that are pretty similar. One from Professor Abigail Kazembe and the other from Thaiboy. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that name not correctly. And these really all relate to funding. And the question here is, can you speak to issues of funding that somehow influence colonization? And the other is, how do we advocate for more international funding for medical education research in Africa? So over to you, and yeah.
Thank you for the questions. I think funding is always a touching subject, because this is what we need at the end of the day. I think your funding partners, whether it is, I think your funding agencies that exist, let's talk about those. I think it's continuing with collaborations and finding your global north partners, but it's the relationship that needs to be redefined, where it's mutually beneficial and not one directional. That is important in any partnership, whether it's with north-south, south-south, and south to south. I think we need to have collaboration that is mutually beneficial. So the existing, yes, there's not more funding that I know of, but I think what we need to realize that the traditional funding models are also slowly changing, so that where we used to look for funding and the funding calls, there's alternate fundings. I will use an example that I've recently discovered, and I'm yet to tap into that, is that there's from your SDGs goals, there's certain funding that exists that's not necessarily purely medical education, but by collaboration across your disciplines within, say, environmental health or social science. There is definitely other options to explore. That's the one thing that I've learned over the past 2 years. And then the second thing is that your partnerships that exist currently is also, I mean, money is tight everywhere, but it doesn't mean that we should just wait for opportunities to happen to you. I was in a training this morning, and funding also came up, and our facilitator had said you should have one proposal in your waiting in draft. So when you see the call coming out, that you are ready, because most of the time, or in my personal experience, you see the funding call and you have 2 weeks, and then that influences your success of the outcome of the funding. But if I had the answers for funding and additional funding, then I think I wouldn't be here. But I do think that we should look at alternate funding and collaborating without outside of our healthcare, where we normally look for funding.
All right, thank you so much. And yeah, I know we are almost at the top of the hour. I would also want to speak to this question of funding and all that. To me, I think it all comes to the point of being at the table and ability to decide and negotiate for effective and equitable and reciprocal partnerships, in the sense that there is equal recognition of each party's role, and therefore it doesn't feel like one has a power over the other, but it looks like it is a collaborative approach with a reciprocal benefit to both parties involved. So with that said, I see your hand up, Champion. Do you want to say something?
It's just a tiny issue to add on to what you're saying, that I think there should be transparency within the partners as we negotiate. because often the cultures are different from the funder to where the funding is done. I see Josephine is even asking about external time issues and the implementer wants the project done in 2 years, while in Africa, we work on the Central African time and things take time to get even just approval is an issue. So how do we get to sit on that table, like you're saying, but become very transparent on how the operations can be, and understanding our role that if I'm sitting on the table, this is not Champion's project, but Champion is representing a constituency of people that have different views and positions around the very same project. I might agree and sign things on paper, but when it comes to the ground, things do not happen the way that I've agreed to. So how do we create a transparent process and to get to an extent of saying sometimes, you know what, this funding might not be aligned with where we are, and we do not want what we call dead aid, where 2 years later, nothing has changed in our setting. Thanks.
Yeah. All right, then. Thank you so much. Lastly, I would like to mention that the AFREhealth Secretariat has an evaluation, a link that they would like to post to ensure that this session is evaluated. So over to you, Roger, from the AFREhealth end to take over the evaluation part. Yeah, he has posted
yeah.
Yeah, he has posted it in the chat. Please kindly just click on that link and provide an evaluation that will enable AFREhealth serve you better and probably maintain the momentum of engagement in health professions education. So with that said, I would like to say thank you very much, all of you, for attending. To our speakers, thank you so much for the engaging presentations, and to AFREhealth, thank you so much for giving us the platform to see that we really tackle issues that are often very difficult, quite frankly, to discuss, but yet they are important and key in our current African society. I thank you, everyone, and thank you for attending, and good afternoon, good morning to some, and good evening to others. Sure. Bye.